Get off the road! Quick!
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. So if you hadn't guessed already, in this video I'm going to try and recreate one of my favourite scenes from Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. More specifically the scene where Frodo and the gang need to hide from the Nazgul on the road out of Hobbiton. So the most important part of this piece is going to be the hobbits. So I picked up this Fellowship box set from Warhammer at my local hobby shop. But unfortunately these little guys aren't quite posed correctly for the scenes, so... Sorry, yeah, so these guys aren't quite posed correctly for the scenes, so I'm going to have to make a few adjustments. So after removing all the little fellas from their sprues, I gave them a quick tidy up and fitted them to their bases. So at this point in the movie, none of the hobbits have actually got any weaponry yet, so that was the first thing to go. Sorry, Sting. Samwise had to lose his beloved frying pan and his little lettle opener as well. But I think poor Pippin had it worse because not only did he lose his sword, he also had to lose an arm. But he quickly had it fitted back in the correct position. So after not too long, I had 4 modified hobbits that were ready to go. But just as importantly as the hobbits, I needed a Nazgul. So I also picked up this Ringwraiths of Angmar box set from Warhammer. Unfortunately for this guy, there was no modifications that needed to be made, so I just removed any burrs, tidied up the miniature and glued it together. So one of the things I will openly admit is that I am really rubbish at painting miniatures, so I'm going to cheat a little bit on this one. I've got a really talented friend who goes by the name of Rabid Roach on Instagram, and these guys are all going to be shipped off to him to receive a really awesome paint job. And I'll put a link in the description to Mr. Roach's page so you can go and check out his really awesome work. So in the meantime, while Mr. Roach works his magic, I'm going to get started on some landforms. I decided for this piece I'd use a round wooden plaque for the base so I can try and create some interest from all angles. I marked out a few guidelines on the plaque to give me a rough idea of how I wanted to frame the scene. And then using some cheap packing foam I could then start to create some rough landforms. I started by breaking off small pieces of the foam just so it'd leave me with a rougher texture for the ledge. Then once I was happy, I set the foam in place using a little bit of hot glue. Then I removed any overhanging foam using the hot wire foam cutter to give me a nice clean finish. Then I could continue using the hot wire foam cutter to create some height variations in the landforms. Then I used some cardboard tubing to try and recreate what would eventually become the tree stump that the hobbits hide under. The cardboard tubing is going to act as a rough structure that's going to allow me to add texture on top, rather than building it all up from scratch. I just cut the cardboard tubing into a rough shape that I needed and then hot glued it into place on top of the foam. And it was at this point that I realised that I wasn't really very happy with the bevel that I'd left in the side of the foam. So I decided to make some more adjustments. I cut another piece of foam to the same size as the base and glued it to the bottom to give the piece some more height. Then I cut a few pieces of polypropylene sheet to create a border around the piece. This is a step I normally do on most of my dioramas, but I hadn't planned to for this piece in particular. Mainly because I knew it was going to be a round base, so I didn't know if it was going to work as well. But you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And to be honest, my usual double-sided tape trick seemed to work pretty well on this, so I was quite pleased. So then it was time to mix up some good old sculptor mould. I mixed it up in a regular way into a fairly stiff consistency, just so it didn't take too long to dry. Then I could start to apply it to the base to create some more realistic landforms. I like to start by applying it mostly with the tongue depressor, and then when there's a good amount on top of the piece I can then use my hands to create a little bit more texture and smooth everything out. Then once I had a good coverage, I used a stiff bristle brush to apply some more texture to the edge of the ledge. Then I added a good amount of sculptor mould to the inside of the cardboard tubing to try and build up some texture and create the tree trunk. Then once I was happy with all the landforms, I set the piece aside for 24 hours to dry. Then the next day the sculptor mould had completely dried and formed a really nice solid layer across the top of all the foam. Then it was time to create the rest of the stump and some tree roots, and for this I decided to use some milliput. Milliput is a 2-part epoxy putty that dries solidly over a few hours, so it's great for sculpting things. You just need to mix it in 2 equal parts until it all becomes a uniform colour. Once it's mixed thoroughly, it's ready to use. I started by rolling the milliput into a bunch of sausage shapes. This is going to give me the rough shape of the tree roots, which I can then apply to the piece and the cardboard tubing in order to try and sculpt out a tree stump. I just applied one piece at a time and built up a number of roots until I had a look that I was happy with. Then once I had enough of the roots in place, I could then come in with a few tools and start sculpting everything into a more natural look. I used the sharp end of a spatula to etch in some lines to create a bark texture. Then I used the end of a stiff wire brush to give the bark a rougher texture. I just repeated these steps, working on a small section at a time until I had a look I was happy with. Then I took some natural roots that I'd dried out and applied them to the overhanging sections. I used some milliput to smooth them out together and create a transition, and set everything aside for a few hours to dry. Then once the milliput was almost dry but still a little bit pliable, I used an engraving tool in my Dremel just to give some more definition to that bark texture. So once I was finally happy, I quickly removed any dust left over from the Dremel and then began to apply my last layer of texture with some Agralan earth from Games Workshop. This is essentially just a coloured crackle paste, so hopefully as it dries it's going to give us some nice intricate cracks that are really going to enhance that bark texture. Now I didn't really want to cover up all of that work that I'd just done with the Dremel, so I applied it sparingly on the top of most of the roots, fairly thickly. Then I put the piece to one side and gave it a few hours to dry. And to be honest, it gave me some pretty good results, so I was quite happy with this. Then I gave the whole piece a coat of black gesso mixed in with some Mod Podge. The Mod Podge is just going to give all of that bark texture a little extra layer of protection, and the gesso is going to give everything a good coat of uniform primer ready for paint. And this time I decided to try and speed up the drying process. Then the tree stump was ready for paint, and for a little change of pace I decided to use only brushwork on this piece because I feel like I use my airbrush a little bit too much sometimes. So I started by giving the entire piece a really heavy dry brush with some burnt umber. Then I dry brushed on a second layer using some flat earth. Then I came in with a super soft makeup brush and gave it a third coat with some silver grey. This left me with a really good base colour that we could then start applying some washes to. I started with the Slimy Grime enamel wash from AK Interactive. I applied this to the front area of the tree just to imply some mossy undertones. Then I applied a few brown and grey muted tones just to get a little colour variation on certain roots. Then it was a case of just introducing a little white spirit on the end of the brush just to try and blend all of those different tones together. And while all the enamel washes were drying, I could then concentrate on applying some dirt texture. And I decided to use some dark earth texture paste from AK Interactive for the first layer. So using an old stiff brush, I applied the texture paste over all the ground areas on the piece, before switching over to a finer brush just to get in between all of the tree roots, trying my best not to get any on the stump. And while the texture paste was still wet, I sprinkled over some fine dried earth from my garden as my second layer of ground cover. This was all then locked into place with some isopropyl alcohol and some scenic cement from Woodland Scenics. So then after, yep, you guessed it, some more drying time, I could then turn my attention to the finer details on the tree. I dry brushed on some more silver grey just to restore some of the highlights that had been lost under the enamel washes. Then using some pale blue from Vallejo and a toothpick, I tried to create an effect on top of some of the roots that looked like lichen. I applied the paint quite sparingly because I was aiming for a bit more of a subtle effect. Then for the second layer, I added some moss and lichen effect from Vallejo over the top using the same method. And to give the ground a little more of a forest floor look, I crushed up and sprinkled over some more dried roots. Which I then followed up with some scale leaves. This all got locked in using the usual method of isopropyl alcohol and scenic cement from Woodland Scenics. And then to give the tree stump that final little bit of visual interest, I created a moss effect using some matte Mod Podge and some fine turf from Woodland Scenics. This is their T45 green grass variety. One of the great things about this technique is the foam itself actually acts like a sponge, so you can water down a few different colours of green paint and apply it to the foam to give it a bit more of a highlight. And it always looks a little drastic at this point, but once it's had some time to dry, it leaves a really nice subtle effect. So the next thing on my list was to create some foliage. I'm going to be using these laser cut bracken ferns from AK Interactive, but on their own they're all a little bit plain because they're all laser cut onto green paper. So to give all the ferns a little bit of variation, I mixed up a few different tones of green paint with some water and applied it over the sheet. I gave them a coat of matte varnish off camera just to give them a little bit more protection, and once everything had dried, I started to remove the ferns from the sheet. And I'm not going to lie, but this was a really difficult job. I don't know if it was the matte varnish that had made them all stick together more, or it was just me being stupid, but they were really difficult to get out of the sheet. So after some perseverance and some ripping and tearing and a few choice words, I had a few usable ferns that I could then start to fit to the piece. Thankfully, this was a bit of an easier job. I just used a little bit of matte Mod Podge and a few tools just to hold everything in place. Then after a few minutes, I finally had something that was starting to look like the scene from the movie. But it was going to need more than just a few ferns, so I broke out my stash of Diorama press-a-pay materials and set to work making the area look nice and green. Then to create a little more scenic interest in the scene behind the stump, I used some old dried out roots to act as logs and super glued them in place. They received the same paint scheme as the tree stump, and of course I had to add that moss effect. Then I finished off this area by adding a good amount of plants and bushes. And with that, the base was finished. So all that was left to do was sit back and wait patiently for the postman to arrive with the stars of the show. And as expected, Mr. Roach came through with a fantastic paint job. They came out really nicely, so I'm really pleased. And they're going to really help to finish this piece off. Then after a quick tidy up with some black gesso, I could finally say this piece was finished. So firstly, a massive thank you for Rabid Roach for doing such a beautiful paint job on all these miniatures. And thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really would love to know what you think, so please leave a comment down below. But until next time, I'll see you in the next one.